The second hand on the café clock scraped past noon again, and Margaret felt the quiet humiliation of being seen alone for too long. The kind that settles into your shoulders and makes you shrink without meaning to. She had arrived early, hopeful in a way she hadn't been in years, and now 2 full hours had slipped by while her coffee went cold and strangers came and left in pairs. Outside the window, Chicago kept moving as if nothing important were happening, but inside her chest, everything felt suspended. What if this were you, waiting and waiting, wondering whether you were foolish for believing something good might finally show up? Would you stay, or would you gather what was left of your pride and walk away before the world noticed? Margaret had chosen the café because it felt neutral, safe. A place where disappointment could blend into the background noise of steaming milk and low music. She was 42, divorced, and carrying a quiet exhaustion that came from rebuilding life piece by piece. The blind date had been arranged by her church's outreach coordinator, a woman with kind eyes who believed deeply in second chances. Margaret hadn't wanted to do it at first. She told herself she was content with her job at the public library, her small apartment on the north side, and Sunday dinners alone. But loneliness has a way of sneaking into ordinary moments, and on a rainy Tuesday evening she had agreed, hoping not for fireworks but for something steady, something human. The man was supposed to arrive at 10. By 11, Margaret told herself he was late because of traffic. By noon, she told herself he wasn't coming at all. She rehearsed the polite explanations she would give if anyone asked why she had been sitting there so long. She wondered if this was a sign from God or just another small cruelty of timing. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coat, deciding that leaving was the only way to save herself from the ache growing heavier with every glance at the door. That was when she saw him. He entered slowly, like someone crossing a threshold that mattered more than it should. His name, she would later learn, was Thomas. At first glance, he looked older than the photo she'd been shown, his hair more silver than brown, his posture guarded. He carried a worn leather bag in one hand, and there was something in his eyes that made Margaret pause, something cautious and deeply tired. The shock didn't come from his appearance alone, though that was part of it. It came from recognition, sharp and immediate, like a bruise pressed unexpectedly. She knew that face. Or at least, she knew the story behind it. Years earlier, Margaret had volunteered at a rehabilitation center in Indiana after her divorce, desperate to feel useful when her own life felt like rubble. There had been a man there, quiet and withdrawn, who kept his head down during group sessions and left as soon as they ended. He had lost his sight in a construction accident, the result of a chain of small mistakes that ended everything he thought he would be. Margaret had never spoken to him directly, but she remembered his presence, the way grief seemed to cling to him like a second skin. Seeing him now, walking into the café with careful steps, her heart lurched. The blind date was blind in more ways than one. Thomas stood near the entrance, clearly unsure where to go, his gaze unfocused, his shoulders tense. Margaret watched him scan the room with a kind of practiced patience, the kind learned through disappointment. In that moment, she felt the weight of her own waiting shift. This was not the story she had imagined, not the easy beginning she'd secretly hoped for. This was something heavier, something that asked more of her than polite smiles and small talk. If you were in her place, would you feel cheated or would you feel called to stay? Margaret remained seated, her heart pounding, as Thomas slowly made his way forward. She realized then why he was late. The city had not been built for men like him, and every step he took was a negotiation with a world that rarely slowed down. The anger she had felt just minutes before dissolved into something more complicated, a blend of empathy and fear. She was afraid not of him, but of herself, of what it might mean to open her life to someone carrying such visible loss when she was still managing her own invisible wounds. They spoke eventually, in careful, halting rhythms, learning each other's stories without the rush of expectation. Margaret learned that Thomas had once been a project manager with dreams of early retirement and a lake house in Michigan. After the accident, his marriage had collapsed under the strain of resentment and grief. He had moved states, started over, and found a fragile sense of peace volunteering with adaptive sports programs. He learned that Margaret had loved deeply and lost painfully, that she feared becoming invisible as the years passed, that she believed faith was less about certainty and more about staying when it was easier to leave. The afternoon stretched on, unnoticed by the cafe staff who stopped glancing at them after a while. There was no sudden romance, no cinematic spark that erased their pasts. Instead, there was something quieter and more unsettling. Understanding. Margaret felt her defenses soften, not because Thomas impressed her, but because he did not try to. He carried his brokenness openly, and in doing so made room for hers. The shock she had felt turned into a strange gratitude, the kind that comes when life refuses to give you what you asked for but offers something truer instead. When they finally parted ways, the city felt different. The noise seemed less harsh, the streets less lonely. Margaret walked home with the awareness that nothing had been resolved and everything had changed. She knew there would be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments when fear would tell her to retreat into safety. But she also knew that waiting those 2 hours had not been a mistake. It had been a test of patience, of compassion, of whether she was willing to see past her own expectations. Weeks later, as winter settled in and the days grew shorter, Margaret would think back to that moment in the café, to the choice she almost made to leave. She would realize how close she had come to missing a connection that did not promise happiness but offered honesty. In a world obsessed with perfect timing and flawless beginnings, their story unfolded slowly, imperfectly, teaching her that love sometimes arrives late, carrying scars, asking you to meet it where it is rather than where you wish it would be. Before the story ends, take a moment and ask yourself, what would you have done if you were Margaret, and what might you still be waiting for in your own life? If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of patience and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, but only if it truly touched your heart.